Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones, still sans haircut here if you're watching on YouTube. But for those of you listening, that doesn't matter. I'll get one maybe next week. That's neither here nor there. What you should know is I pastor Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. We're a church that welcomes and strives to include all. Something I am keen to emphasize these days as attacks on the rights of my queer friends has been amped up of late, which is why churches like my own will be very important in the years to come, but I digress. In the meantime, if you like what you hear on the Northwood Podcast, I would love to know about it by way of perhaps a thumbs up on a video or an episode of the podcast if you're listening to it audibly, or you can like or subscribe to us. However the app that you use to listen or watch frames it, interact in some way. Leave a comment or share the Northwood Podcast with someone you think could benefit from it. This is one way that the internet helps us spread the word. I'm told more shares and likes and things like that will help aggregate it to other people who may want to listen. So while we're on the topic of podcasts, you should check out all of the other offerings of the All Indiana Podcast Network. The All Indiana Podcast Network produces podcasts like our own, all recorded and produced in Indiana, and often on topics of interest to Hoosiers. Hoosiers being that funny word we call ourselves. But even if you are listening out of state, there's something for everyone. The topics run the gamut on the All Indiana Podcast Network, from sports to politics to religion to small talk about even pet ownership I saw in one podcast. So it's all there. So check it out if you will, or if you want. The All Indiana Podcast Network. You can find them at www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. One last thing. If you'd like to learn more about Northwood, our church, please check out our website. It's www.indyncc.org, INDYNCC.org, and there you can find our contact information and much else that you may want to know. So please, at your discretion. Now, we're about to move into our episode. But first, we need to stop for some ads for our podcast listeners. And so if you're watching, you just have this awkward moment with me where we just pause and wait. But if you are listening, here are some ads. And we're back. Today is a bit different in that we're going to be considering two passages from the Bible. We usually just consider one. And each of these are written centuries apart and in completely different parts of the Bible. So to synthesize them could seem a challenge from the onset. But they're related. You'll see why. But I don't want to bog us down with long readings up front. So I'm going to break them up for the sake of the podcast. And the first reading, the first passage, is found in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. That's 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10. And I'll just begin. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your victory. There is no holy one like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has borne many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor, and the Lord makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked will perish in darkness. For not by might does one prevail. The Lord, his adversaries, will be shattered. The Most High will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. And that's the end of what felt like several paragraphs of prose, but in fact were song, poetry, meant to be sung. And so I did very poor justice in rendering it to you. And I also realized that we just dropped into the middle of a woman's prayer here. So perhaps we should all find some context. The woman praying here is named Hannah. Hannah is the wife of a man named Elkanah. And if you didn't know that was a prayer, again, I should have prefaced it. That's the way it began, but Hannah prayed, but maybe you missed it. It's a prayer, song, poem, and wife of this man named Elkanah. And I should say rather, she was one of two wives of this man, because polygamy was a rather common arrangement in the Bible. And these arrangements may naturally pit two women in competition with one another, as was apparently the case between Hannah and her husband's other wife. For you see, Hannah had no children. And in the Bible times, you may know by now that it's a big deal and it's bad for a woman. The other wife, named of Peninnah, had many sons and daughters, the text reads, the chapter that came just before this song that we read. And this was a serious matter for Hannah in a culture that so valued a woman's ability to produce children. A woman who was barren, like Hannah, was viewed by some as just another mouth to feed, or hands to do the chores, or perhaps worse, perhaps as a curse, a cursed person, and therefore to be shunned or avoided. And we read in the previous chapter of how her husband's other wife would deride her for her inability to have children, as if it were her fault. Well, she herself, she pointed out, had numerous children. She had fulfilled her wifely role in those days. So she could therefore be exalted, lifted up in her culture. And this, by the way, I think is very bad, that a woman's worth could be reduced to her ability to produce children, as sometimes happens, even in so-called advanced and modern cultures. I even know a few people myself who may think that way. But this is the way it was then, nearly across the board, and I digress. I just bring it all up to emphasize that before this woman, Hannah, prayed this prayer that we just read, she had been previously praying at this same temple a prayer of sorrow and lament. What you just heard was a hymn of celebration and rejoicing, but before she was praying so fervently that she seemed so distraught that the text reads that the local priest, Eli, thought that she was drunk and even went up to say, hey, cool it on the wine. But once he discerned that she was praying in earnest, he was moved by her desperation, and so apparently was God. For in short order, she had a son. And what's more, the son has been dedicated to serving God. He will be the prophet Samuel. The son has risen on the life of a woman who before had very little to hope for. And this is the context for Hannah's song. Makes sense? I mean, wouldn't you sing if something comparable had happened to you? But what I want you to know today is that hers is not the only song. Hers is but one song sung in a chorus of many voices who have found hope when they had before only known despair. Which brings me to the second passage, another story dropped in here, but many, 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 many centuries later. It's a story that I'm confident you're familiar with, or probably, and if not, it's okay. Here it goes. It's from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 39 through 57, and it goes, In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and exclaimed with a loud cry, Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord. End quote. We'll be coming back to what comes next, because Mary, who Elizabeth is talking to, is about to erupt in song. And you also may be thinking, but wait, that's Christmas. You just read a Christmas story. And I'll here remind you what I say around that time of year, what I truly believe. And it's that what's true then is still true now, that the hope we feel so powerfully on December 25th can still captivate us in June or July or right now, the end of May, really at any time. So with that in mind, I'll continue. But before we read the song that Mary sings, a few things to note. Similar, to give some context to Hannah's song, we should give some context to Mary's song. And you should note that there are two women in this story. I don't want you to miss that there are two women who are here blessed by a supernatural birth. Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, who she's coming to visit, has conceived past the years where conception was thought possible. It's another one of those miraculous births in old age. And she, just like Hannah, had found herself to be a social pariah because she had not been able to conceive before. And perhaps her community was wondering why God had closed up her womb. For that is what they thought back then, that God closed up wombs. So people reasoned God must have a problem with her. Then, so too we, is the logic that is at play. But I guess when all is said and done, we'll grasp at any straw to shore up our bigotries and hatreds. But Elizabeth is now pregnant, against the odds, with a future prophet, John the Baptist, to boot. And now she has hope again. So much hope that her husband couldn't even believe when she told him. And now Mary, pregnant out of wedlock, comes to her with news of her own. Elizabeth discerns through the Spirit that Mary holds in her belly the long-anticipated Messiah. So she immediately proclaims a blessing onto Mary, to which Mary then erupts in song. And here is what she sang. And notice the echoes and the similarities. We are meant to see the echoes between this song and the song that Hannah sang. I'll just read it for you. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowly state of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. Indeed, his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has come to the aid of his child Israel and remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever." And the text here concludes, "And Mary remained with her about 3 months and then returned to her home." Now, if that song sounded familiar, it should have. If you had trouble distinguishing it from what we read at the very onset, at the beginning of this talk, there's a reason for it. Because Mary repeated at moments, nearly verbatim, what Hannah sang so long before her. In fact, it is highly likely that Hannah even inspired her song. For even where Mary doesn't nearly repeat her words, the rest of it echoes the same tune, if you will. Hannah once sang, for instance, in verses 4 and 5 of 1 Samuel chapter 2, "The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil." And then compare that to what Mary said in verses 52 and 53 of Luke chapter 1. She sang, "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." It's virtually the same, at least the same sentiment, if not many of the same words. Both women singing songs of joy in defiance of a hard world that did not often bend in their favor, where they see those who have been lifted up and wrongfully so around them are now demoted, while those like Mary and Elizabeth and Hannah are lifted up and called blessed. The last will be first, the first will be last. God finding favor with these women, and they were given strength and hope where they had none before, empowered when their culture would not empower them. For Mary, after this encounter though, the outside world would remain much the same. Her land was occupied by the Roman Empire. Her communities remained poor. But in that context, God had called new life, and she knew it. Jesus would be born, Jesus on the way from her perspective, and no one could have imagined what would come next. And now here we are, the church, and what I want you to see is that these patterns repeat. Barren wombs that God fills with life. Hungry bellies that God fills with bread. Thirsty, hopeless, overwhelmed people, the likes of Hannah, Elizabeth, and Mary, all put upon, and for no good reason. And each of these women handed less than a desirable hand, and yet they were able to sing songs of joy in defiance of a hard world and in celebration of the life they found in the midst of it. And they could envision a world where the last would be first, and those who had been pushed down would be elevated. As I said, these patterns repeat. And their stories are not the only ones. There was once, for instance, a starving and thirsty woman in the wilderness, barely holding on to her child Ishmael in tow. You can read of this in Genesis. You see, Ishmael's father, Abraham, had sent away his son and his son's mother, Hagar, who was also his slave, in preference for his quote-unquote true-born son, Isaac, son of his quote-unquote true wife, Sarah. But God did not forget Hagar or Ishmael. And God met this desperate woman in her desperate place, and she found life in the face of her obstacles. Water in the desert, a child to bless her womb and life thereafter. And her song, her life's echo, echoes Hannah's and Mary's. The rest of a sermon like this could be spent highlighting other examples from the Bible, but then we'd be here all day. So instead, I'd like to pause and consider what song of hope that we might add today, in the year 2024, to the chorus. As I said, patterns repeat. Barren lives given new bursts of energy and vitality in times and places that otherwise feel desperate. I myself feel that we are, culturally speaking, in this place that is desperate, worried, anxious about the future, wars and rumors of wars, violence across the globe, appalling violence across the globe, I might add, compounded by rising famines and droughts, and more to come if projections predicting a warmer climate in the future pan out, as they are actively doing around us, unfortunately. Yet, we are still called to join together to sing a joyful song, a song that sings of the hope that we still hold for our world and our place in it. We sing hymns in churches in defiance of the violence we witness in our own time, in defiance of the greed that drives the poverty we see around us, and in defiance of all that would hint at death and despair. We find ways to echo the songs of Hannah and Mary. Remember, this call toward a radical hope is baked into the very heart of our story and of our faith. For we believe that when Jesus confronted the forces of death in his own turn in our world, he did indeed die. They killed him. But you may have heard it said before, and it bears repeating, that where others see a tomb in which Jesus was laid, Christians see something more akin to a womb, something that is about to burst forth into life. Just when others think that all is lost, Christians see potential for life, even if we've got to squint to see it. So our task today is to notice how these patterns repeat and remember this. And just as surely as winter gives way to spring, understand that this too, these times, your struggle shall pass. And as we witness the end of many life cycles in our land, of institutions falling apart or rebuilding, of old ways passing away and new ways beginning, remember the stories of those who came before. Remember the patterns that repeat by God's grace. Winter to spring, darkness to light, death breaking forth to life. And once we've caught a glimpse of this hope, we must call others to find what we have found. So let's join in the song in our own way. Use your own words. Find your own tune. I expect to see these patterns repeat yet again in our lifetime. And if you are feeling down or hopeless, remember this. Remember the women whose lives we talked about today. How even in their places of quiet, despair, or discomfort, they were able to sing a new song to God. They were given that song as a gift, and they were given life, and then some. A new song is about new futures. So let's find our own words of hope and joy to sing today and add our own harmonies to this chorus.